Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, fellow reflectives, and welcome to episode 62 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In this episode, I interview Laura Shanae Crenshaw. Laura is a writer, a world builder, a photographer, an all-around creative person, and as is the topic of the interview you're about to hear, the creator of the Mythulu card deck, a fabulous tool for writers. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. Right now, a bit of a personal update. As I record this, it's Valentine's Day, February 14th, and the last book in the Fiction River anthology series that I edited, Fiction River, Feel the Love, just came out. I spent the morning reflecting on love, which I'll get to later in this episode. But early this morning, I finished the final bits of work on the completed manuscript for Fiction River, Superstitious. Yes, another theme that I was pursuing. I turned that in to WMG Publishing this morning. It's another fantastic book in an incredible series of wonderful writers. And the stories that I have collected here are from some phenomenal writers, some amazing stories that, in that case, touch on superstition, and in the previous one, touched on elements of love. And it was just in time that I turned this in because right now I'm in the throes of reading for two more WMG books that I'm going to be editing for. I have 1.5 million words of stories to read, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that process in the next couple of weeks. Now, I spoke about Superstar's writing seminars in the last episode, in episode 61, just about 48 hours ago, where I shared a few brief tidbits of info from the Superstars Writing Seminars 2001 session, which I just got back from. And in that, I included a brief interview with Adriel Wiggins. Now, I'd mentioned that I planned on doing short Facebook Live interviews from the conference, like I had last year in 2018, but I wasn't able to get to it, or rather I was so engaged in interacting with people when I wasn't on stage or in one-on-one meetings or hallway conversations that it never felt natural to just, crank it up and do a Facebook Live video. It just felt unnatural, so I didn't do it. I just kind of went with the flow. So my apologies to anyone who was waiting to spot those interviews like I had done last year. Now, Adriel recorded the video of the chat that we did together, and that appears in episode 61. And it was funny. She had her phone propped up and recorded the video, and I had my phone with mics connected to it while I recorded the audio on my own phone. But other than that, there were no live posted videos. Heck, I barely got any selfies in this time around, and I love selfies. I maybe only photobombed about 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different groups of people. I lost track of that one. But again, Superstars Writing Seminars was another amazing one. One of the highlights for me was walking with Jeffrey Deaver to a local brewery one evening after the sessions and learning that this writer I have admired for so long also enjoys a hearty walk and a delicious craft beer. We chatted about our mutual love of dogs, talked about my dogs, and he talked about his dogs as well. And he was leaving that weekend to go to a dog show as well. So that was another fascinating insight to a writer I admire. I got to meet and chat with so many more folks at the conference, and not just the friends I had already made at previous Superstars, but friends I hadn't seen in years, and many more new ones. Always an amazing experience. At the VIP dinner on the Friday night, The people at our table were so consumed in our conversation, which kind of evolved from talking about writing to sharing some really fun ghost stories. But we got so distracted and consumed in the conversation that we got politely kicked out by the staff because we're up on the third floor, which is a special event space, and obviously only open for that VIP dinner. But it was amazing because we didn't even notice the time pass. We didn't even notice that most of the other tables of folks had already gotten up and left. Those are my favorite types of conversations, when you're just there and everyone's engaged and we're all sharing stuff and you don't even notice what's going on around you. Absolutely amazing. And those are the kinds of conversations that you end up having at Superstars throughout the weekend, which makes it such an amazing and powerful event. Now, among almost a dozen panels that I was in, I moderated a panel on indie versus traditional publishing. Yes, I see value in both sides, and I believe that a proper combination of both is the ideal situation for a writer. You see, both sides have their strengths, both sides have their value, both sides have incorrect assumptions about the other side. I find it interesting to be able to stand in the middle of both worlds, kind of like I was doing as I was moderating this panel, and to be able to see the light and the dark that exist within both. But better than anything, to see the incredible wealth of opportunity that is available to writers like no other time in the history of writing and publishing. It's a reminder to me that it truly is an amazing time to be a writer. Now, interestingly, one of the most memorable and poignant moments I experienced happened in parallel to the conference. I also got this chance to hang out with the son of a friend of mine. Now, Julie's a pretty awesome person, and so is her husband. So when I found out that her son was attending school in Colorado Springs and that he watched a TV show, Letterkenny, which is shot in my old hometown of Sudbury, Ontario, and that's where the local brewery produces the beer Puppers, which is used on the TV show Letterkenny. And her son was a huge fan of the show. So I had to bring him a can of it. I couldn't be that close and not get that opportunity. Now, he took the time during a busy work and study schedule to take me to a local brewery that he really enjoyed, and also to an awesome new whiskey bar called Cask and Cork. Now, this young man is only 21 years old, but he carried about him a maturity, a charisma, and a wisdom that I just really appreciated. Now, all throughout the evening of chatting and joking with him, I kept thinking of two things. First thing I thought of was Liz, my partner, has adult children who are amazing people, tremendously intelligent, insightful, beautiful, and compassionate young women, all with a sharp wit and a powerful sense of humor. All these things that I admire. They're the type of people that I enjoy hanging out with, not out of obligation of family or anything like that, but because they're delightful and wonderful people that I respect and I admire. And I felt that same way about my friend's son. And I kept thinking that if this was my own son, who's currently 14 years old, and of course we get along very, very well, but if my own son, who's currently 14, grows up to be even half as awesome, as mature, as compassionate, as funny, as intelligent, as amazing as this young man that I was spending the evening with, I'll know that I was a pretty decent parent. It's funny. Every year I go to Superstars, I learn great new things about the craft and the business of writing. But I also end up learning such incredible things that I never expected. And this interview with Laura is one of those things. I wasn't expecting it, but when Laura approached me and showed me this amazing deck of cards, I was overwhelmed. I thought this was perfect. It was the thing I hadn't been expecting, but enjoyed so much. And we'll get to the explanation of her awesome Mythulu deck in just a moment, after a word about this episode's sponsor. Now, during Superstars writing seminars, I sat on at least 2 or 3 panel discussions about audiobooks. In it, I shared my own experiences with creating audiobooks, as well as the things that surprised me about my own audiobook sales. In 2018, for example, audiobook sales accounted for 6% of my writing income, and print represented 33%, ebooks 35%, and audio came in at 6%. And within audiobook sales, I was surprised and delighted with seeing sales coming from places that weren't what I would call the usual suspects. I expected sales to be coming from Audible, from Kobo Audiobooks, from Google Play, from Apple. Most of my sales came from a half dozen other retailers and library channels. This to me is a reminder of the importance of getting your audiobooks out into the broadest markets possible. In the same way that less than 50% of my ebook income comes from Kindle, Amazon, world's biggest bookstore, if I was exclusive to that single channel, my income would be more than cut in half. And that would be a lot smaller if I was exclusive to Audible for audiobooks. So I'm pleased to be using Findaway Voices to get my works distributed to the broadest possible global network of retailers and libraries that include Amazon, Apple, Google, Kobo, Overdrive, and dozens of others. Just because you haven't heard of them doesn't mean that you can't earn money from them. Well, that's it for my long, rambling intro to this episode. Let's jump into this amazing and insightful conversation with Laura as she explains the Mythulu deck. Hey, Laura, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I got a chance to see a demo of this amazing product that you've shared with folks here at Superstars Writing Seminars.
Thank you.
And tell me a little bit about, before we get into the project, yourself as a writer. How did you get into writing and when did you start?
That's actually a funny story. I have a little bit of an unusual intro into writing. I've wanted to be a writer since I was really, really little, and it's my sister's fault.
Okay.
When she was really young, she just had a wild imagination. She loved imaginary friends.
Okay.
And I was 4 or 5 years younger than her, and so when I was like a toddler, I just believed everything she said.
Okay.
So she told me she had imaginary dragon friends, and I totally believed her.
Okay.
And so it started out very innocently when I was like 3 or 4. She would just tell me these stories. And she would tell me that at night when she dreamed, she could go real places.
Okay.
And so right before bed, they were my bedtime stories that I grew up with. She would tell me about all these magical places that she had gone with her dragon.
Okay.
And I would fall asleep to these stories,
Oh, wow.
and then I would dream about dragons.
Okay.
And about going on these magical adventures, and I totally believed that I was going real places because my big sister had told me so.
Right.
And so the next day she would ask me what I dreamed about, and I would tell her, and she would weave those stories into her dreams and just pretend that we were both going places, dreaming together. We shared dreams like this for 10 years.
Really?
Yes.
That's amazing.
It was really fun. So at some point along the line, I realized that we were just pretending.
Right.
But it was still so much fun.
Yeah.
That we just kept doing it. So she's older now. She's married. She has kids. But so it's harder for her to write.
Right.
But I've kind of carried on the torch with
Okay.
writing and storytelling, and I still lean on her a lot and go to her every time I have a story. I'm like, hey, Sarah, what do you think of this?
Oh, that's
So
fantastic.
that's how I got started in writing.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that. I love that collaborative sister storytelling magic that's happening. That is cool. So let's talk about this project and the cards and what is it?
So Mythulu is a creativity enhancement tool.
Okay.
The purpose of it is to help you fill in the gaps in your story and deepen your story, question assumptions that you've made,
Okay.
and fix things or fill things in if they don't feel quite right.
Okay.
So the basic idea behind it is it's been well researched. If you read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow,
I'm reading it now.
it's an amazing
Yes.
book. It's a thick read. It's easier to listen to on audio tape.
I have the audio.
Good.
Yeah, so
Good.
we're in sync here.
Okay, yeah. So for the listeners who don't know, Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel Peace Prize winner in economics, and he was deeply involved in some studies of like how much the human brain could track. And it turns out human brain can only hold 6 ideas at a time.
Okay.
And we tend to go to whatever we have seen or heard most recently.
Okay.
That's what sticks. So when we look at storytelling, like if we ask ourselves a question about our story, we're only going to have about 6 possible iterations
Okay.
before we run out of ideas.
Right.
And we're going to go to whatever we've seen most recently. Most people will give up after 6 tries.
Okay.
So with the Mythulu cards, we really wanted to help people break out of those ruts and have wildly new ideas. Because oftentimes when you're telling a story, you have that heart and soul of the story that you're trying to tell. And as you go to tell that story, there are sideline details you have to fill in.
Right.
What they are doesn't necessarily matter, but they do have to be interesting. And that is what makes the difference between stories that feel like something you've seen before and something that feels incredibly fresh.
Okay.
So it's also opportunity to use really good quality writing craft, to use parallelism and symbolism in your stories, to use archetypes really intelligently. That is what differentiates the masters from the average writer.
Okay.
So I put together a collection of 150 archetypes in 6 different categories.
Okay.
These are principles of human interaction, and they make it easy for people to randomize those corner details in the stories to fill them in with rich meaning instead of running with tropes and cliches.
Okay, so what are the six?
So the 6 categories we picked are elements, habitats, characters, relationships, traits, and textures. Do you want me to explain those a little bit?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. So elements is a really easy archetype to understand. The classic 4 that you see in literature are fire, earth, wind, and water.
Right.
Those are, and those 4 elements come from Chinese theory. Sometimes people also include ether, which is a 5th element. So they're great, they're fun, they're powerful because they have meaning. They're a physical substance that you can use as sources of energy. They determine the value of things. So they're very useful in storytelling. But if you use the same 4 elements all the time, they get really boring.
Okay.
So we have isolated over 50 truly archetypal elements. And a really good example is blood. Okay, so blood is a physical substance. It's used as symbolism in stories all the time.
Yeah.
And when I was looking at the meaning of that card, I read a lot of essays about Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Because Shakespeare uses blood in
most,
if not all, of his plays. And people have very divergent theories on what blood meant in Shakespeare. And some people thought it referred to like revenge, and other people like, no, it represents regret. And on a biological level, you see blood and it triggers a full body response that something is hurt and like you get a rush of adrenaline. So writers will use it as an easy hack in their stories to get a biological response. But I was looking at it and I was like, these theories don't fit every time.
Okay.
Because what about childbirth? There's blood in
Yeah,
childbirth, and the theory of regret doesn't fit there. There's something else going on here. It also doesn't fit in Israelite traditions. They have the story of the lamb's blood being smeared over the doorways. Regret is not the right symbolism there either.
Okay.
What I finally realized is that blood symbolizes the energy invested to keep something alive.
Okay.
And that symbolism fits every time.
Yes.
And when you understand
Positive or negative.
positive or negative,
Yeah.
right? So if you have an emo scene, like in a YA horror story where a teen is cutting, if you understand that blood symbolizes energy invested to keep something alive, then you see that scene and you're like, this is a representation of wastefulness.
Okay.
And you can start to use those archetypes and those elements in really beautiful ways. But you have to get to what the element really means. So we put this flavor text on every card, trying to get to the heart and soul of every element so that people can use these archetypes in really brilliant ways in their stories. So that's just one category. That's elements. To summarize the others more quickly, habitats reflect imbalance in self versus others.
Okay.
In survival versus ambition, habitats are kind of the canvas on which we explore that. So when you're seeing a post-apocalyptic world, you want to use your habitats carefully, and our habitats deck helps you do that. The next 2 decks, characters versus relationships, we initially saw those archetypes because Joseph Campbell's kind of the initial foundation. We glanced at his work and we're like, okay, he's missing a lot here, but people respect his work, so let's take a look at it.
Okay.
There were some archetypes that we disregarded, like villains and heroes, because we're like, this isn't helpful. it's not human to have a black and white label here, so we disregarded those archetypes.
Right.
And then we also looked at his work, and Joseph Campbell lumped professions and relationships together.
Okay.
And we felt that that wasn't useful either, because when you're telling a story and you need one or the other, you really need one or the other. And when you're looking for a relationship, a profession isn't going to do. And when you're looking for a profession, a relationship isn't helpful. So we separated those out into two separate categories. And then traits and textures surprise people that those are in our decks, but I love those cards. Textures change how the world wants to interact with your character, so it's inward energy.
Okay.
So, for example, if something is really fuzzy, everyone wants to touch it, and that can lead to boundaries being violated.
Okay.
So that's inward energy. Traits is the companion deck. Traits change how your subject wants to interact with the world. It's the outward energy.
Okay.
And having those action-oriented motions into two archetype decks in ways that are concrete and have tangible textures that you can come back to makes it really easy for you to show, instead of telling, some of these really important actions. So it makes it fun, it makes it visual, and it's very helpful when you're trying to randomize like a character to have two decks that are more action-oriented than symbolism-oriented. So that's kind of the big picture of how the decks work. That's the thought and love that we put into each of those 6 categories.
So last night, yourself and Shannon McGuire and myself and Tara from Kobo, you did a wonderful demo with the 3 of us where you showed us an example of how a writer might use this and draw
Sure.
the cards, and it reminded me very much of like a tarot reading. It was very much because you were interpreting for us, which
Yeah.
was beautiful because you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
And I immediately saw there's a book in progress where I'm actually stuck on some things, and
Oh.
I'm thinking, well, this sounds to me like I could take this deck and sort of consider the question of this missing element from the book, this
Sure.
one missing element that I need and I've been struggling with. That I could probably use the deck for something like that, to sort of ask questions and potentially use that to fill it in with real details, not just the first thing that comes.
Absolutely.
Okay, so is that how a writer would use it?
Yes, and a good example of this, I did a consultation the other day with Joshua Bennett, who's
Okay.
a rising star writer. He's brilliant, and he
Yeah.
was working on a story, and he had his hero going to rescue a girl.
Okay.
And it was a classic love interest,
Yeah.
and I called him on it.
Okay.
Because one of the things that's really central to Mythulu is that I am passionate about helping people tell new stories.
Okay.
And the cards work best, first of all, when you insert personal experience, but secondly, when you insist on new ideas. Because all of the cards, they're all based on archetypes. You have seen every idea in these cards before,
Right.
for the most part. So if you run with the first thing you see, you're using them wrong.
Okay.
You always want to draw combinations of archetypes and look for where the ideas intersect. Or if you draw
Okay.
something and it's a really obvious answer,
Okay.
then you look for the opposite.
Okay.
So you're always trying to challenge the ideas that come together. So when people come to me for a consultation, I will look for things I've seen before and I challenge them immediately.
Okay.
So he's like, I have this hero going to rescue a girl, and I said, does it have to be a love interest?
Okay.
And he's like, no. And I was like, okay. So I pulled out the relationships deck and we flipped over the entire thing. And we started flipping through every card. And I was
Okay.
like, does this fit? Does this not fit? Like, what's the purpose of him rescuing this girl? What does she symbolize in his personal development?
Okay.
And then we were looking for matches. So we came out of 25 cards, there were 5 that fit. And we picked his 2 favorite.
Okay.
And what we came up with instead of a love interest that he's going to rescue, the hero is a son of a prostitute. He is going to rescue his adoptive mother. This is the first female in his life that has been a major mentor for him. He
Right.
loves her, he admires her, he feels like she has shaped him,
Yeah.
and they didn't part on good terms.
Okay.
And so we totally changed this character.
completely different kind of love.
It's a completely different kind of love, but it's more interesting.
Yeah.
And it hit all the points of what he needed for his character arc.
Right.
And ultimately, it's a different story. And when people read that story, they'll remember it and they'll tell their friends about it because it's not something they haven't seen it 20 billion times. It's new.
Okay. So it sounds like you're asking the writer to not go for the low-hanging fruit.
Exactly.
Right. To reach higher.
Yeah.
And get that impact.
Yes.
So Does it come with instructions? So it's a beautiful box. It's available. So this, so Mythulu is available. Where can people buy this?
Mythulu is available on Amazon. We also have it on our website, mythulu.com.
That's easy enough to remember.
Yeah. So pros and cons of buying it in either way. We have a higher profit margin on our own website.
Of course, yeah.
However, it would also be very helpful for us to have the Amazon reviews. So if people buy it on Amazon and they love it and they review it, that would be wonderful.
And how much does it retail for US?
It is $45 for the whole set of 150 cards, and every card is unique.
Okay, cool. So I want to do a special offer for listeners to this podcast.
Sure.
I am going to be purchasing a copy to give to one lucky listener who would love to try it out. All I ask is you leave a comment on this episode, and after a week I will do a random draw and I will mail it to whoever. So I'm gonna, that way we can do it. I will probably be talking more about how I'm going to be using the deck that I have to help me with some of the stumbling blocks, or what you might consider writer's block. It just means I haven't found the right energy. So, and where can people find out more about you? Is it Mythulu.com, or where can they find out more about you and your writing?
So Mythulu.com is a good place for right now. I haven't published anything yet.
Okay.
I have ghostwritten a book called Never Boss.
Okay.
It's narrative nonfiction, so if like business literature isn't your thing, you might find it excruciatingly boring. But I always insist on fun news stories. When they came to me and they're like, "Hey, set this in the software industry," I was like, hell no. No, we're going to make this more interesting. So it is set in the hazardous waste management industry. So it's a little more fun to read, but it is business literature.
Okay.
I have several pieces that are up and coming. I have been approached by an agent at this conference who wants to see more of my work.
Oh,
so
awesome.
you might
Congratulations.
see more of my name in print soon.
Awesome. So people
great.
will keep an eye out for that.
Yeah.
And so the last sort of question is, what drew you to Superstars? Why did you decide to come here and check it out?
You know, I was very fortunate. I am a friend of James Owen. I met him through a Kickstarter, and he endorsed Mythulu. And we had some great conversations, and when I showed him these cards, he's like, "We need to get you involved in Superstars. You have to come." So I started making plans, and when finances got tight, I sent him a message, and I was like, I don't like, do they have any like volunteer deals? Can I pitch in to have? And he's just like, come as my guest. So James Owen pulled some strings somewhere, and they comped my ticket.
That's cool.
Incredibly
I
generous.
think any one of us would do whatever James needed because he's been there for us.
He's a wonderful man. So I love this conference. I've been blown away by how wonderful and productive it has been to be here, and I have been shown so much generosity. It's left me really wanting to give back for many years.
Awesome. And I'm just so in awe of the research and what you've put into this because, again, like I said, it was like going to a really good tarot reading. You really understand the details and really understand storytelling, and I believe that this is a tool that writers can really benefit from. Thanks for taking the time to share.
Thank you so much, Mark.
I hope you enjoyed that look at the Mythulu deck that Laura was talking about and that she created. And after the interview, I should add that she did say, I'd asked the question about the instructions, and Laura said she spent 3 weeks working on detailed instructions for the card. And of course, when I opened the deck, I found them in front of me. They're very well laid out. There's all kinds of information on examples, how to draw intuitively, what to do when you draw weird cards. There's even card-by-card support available on apps on Android and iOS that are explained there, as well as tips for success and ideas for before you reject a card, ask these questions. Lots of great tips and information. So as mentioned in the interview, we'll be giving away one deck to a lucky listener of the Stark Reflections podcast. It will be drawn within the next 7 or 8 days. I'll announce it on a forthcoming episode. All you have to do is go to this episode, which is episode 62 at starkreflections.ca, and leave a comment. Leave a comment about Mythulu cards. Maybe talk about ways that you deal with writer's block, or tips or tricks that you use. Sharing is caring. And everyone who enters, everyone who comments on that will be entered into a draw. I will, of course, If you're a patron of the show and you leave an entry, that counts twice. You get sort of two chances to win, because, why not give back to the amazing patrons who support the show via patreon.com/starkreflections. Now, speaking of winners, I would like to congratulate Michelle for winning the copy of The Holy Shit Moment by James Fowle. I interviewed James in episode 60 of this podcast just last week. Michelle, thanks for commenting. You were the sole commenter, so that was an easy draw. I didn't even have to bring up the program to do random drawings. It was basically, you left a comment, you won the book. I'll be contacting you to find out how I can get that book to you and your preferred format. For the reflection for this episode, I'm going to go back to something that I introduced at the very beginning. It's related to February 14th and the concept of love. I talked about Fiction River, the Feel the Love anthology that just recently came out. And I've been thinking a lot lately about reflections of love. And this does actually tie in to Laura coming to the conference. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But going back to the concept of love for the anthology, and again, this is something that's really important, is I didn't want it to be just about romantic love. And I wanted to think about that. Now, I'm a very lucky guy. I have this amazing romantic love in my life, but I'm also a very, very lucky guy because I have so many of the other types of love in my life. I feel the love. I feel the compassion from so many of the people that I'm privileged to get to know and work with, and friends and family, and so many things that enrich my life. And that's kind of the element I wanted to think about. I wanted to think about the concept of not just the love that you have for the person you're romantically engaged with, but the love that you have for other human beings, the love that you can have for a beloved pet. You think about the love that a dog has for its human, this unconditional love that is just so ever present. And if you've known the love that an animal can have for a human, you know that type of unconditional love. And that's the kind of things that I'm talking about. And those are the kinds of stories that were written in the anthology. And it's just made me reflect about the elements of love and how it is one of those resources that no matter how much you give, and potentially the more that you give, the more of it that you give, you can always generate more. There's always an endless resource of love to be able to give. But the more that you give, the more that you seem to have in return. And that's quite an amazing thing. And the reason I'm reflecting upon that is because I was thinking about just how I end up feeling when I return from an amazing conference like Superstars Writing Seminars. And James Owen, who's one of the founding members of the conference, was the one who introduced the concept of tribe. And that the folks who are part of this are now part of the tribe. They're part of supporting each other. They're part of a larger family. And I saw so many examples of that over the years at Superstars when tragedy has befallen one of the members of the tribe, one of the family members of this conference. It's amazing to see how other people rally around them, how other people prop them up, how other people support them. They stand beside one another. They reach out. And there's so many examples. I mean, I can go through. There's half a dozen that I can think of off the top of my head of people who had something terrible happen in their lives, whether it was a personal tragedy, a family tragedy, lost loved ones, lost health. And yet, throughout it all, the magic and power of the way that those other people just reached out and stood beside them. And I saw that happen time and again. I was able to feel an amazing power in standing together. And I thought that was really, really important. So Laura came to Superstars because James wanted her to be part of that. And of course, she brought this richness to it, which of course he knew she would bring that to it. So he worked hard to make sure that she could get there, despite the fact that there were some challenges getting there in the first place. That happened to other members there. There was amazing scholarship available for superstars that is generated from funds from attending members, where they're either donating something, there's auctions, there's anthologies that have been published to raise money for the scholarship. And there's so many people who were there on scholarship. And the scholarship is actually named after Don Hodge, who was a member of Superstars. He was a member of the tribe. And unfortunately, Don passed away at the age of 68 in August of 2015 with a long battle with cancer. But he was a member of the family. But every year when we bring in people on scholarships, it's done in Don's memory, which is a beautiful thing. So he's still with us. And the people who are brought there on scholarships are there with us. And again, it's all part of the tribe. It's all part of the family. So the reflection here today is really more about this concept of love and compassion and of standing together. We are writers working in this together. We are, whether we're writers, whether we're publishers, whether we're editors, whether we're assistants, whether we're doing marketing support, we're all in this together to prop one another up. And that's an amazing, powerful thing to think about, because so many times we're sitting by ourselves, we're in a room, we're composing, we're working on the manuscripts, etc. And I'm going to bring this back to something that James Owen has mentioned in his Drawing Out the Dragons talk, as well as the book. And it is the concept that if you really want to do something, no one can stop you. But if you really don't want to do something, no one can help you. And I hearken that back to some examples that James shares in his talk and in Drawing Out the Dragons. And he talks about those hard choices that you make to do the thing that you believe in the most. And usually when people see you working so hard at that thing you believe in, they will find ways to help you. And that's the thing that I'm thinking about. So, on this time of the year where everyone's thinking about love and Valentine's Day and romantic love, I'm thinking about the way that people can prop other people up, that we can reach out to one another and we can share and we can support one another. And that is critical. It's so critical that we give and that we have these things, because that's really what writing is about. It's about connecting two people together. That in itself is the connection. But then for that writing to happen, for that writing to get from your mind to the page and published somewhere, whether it's through traditional methods or whether it's self-published, there's still those connections that you have with other people that make that process that much better. So that was my long, meandering, love-inflicted reflection for this episode. Again, this is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Thanks for joining me here in episode 62 of the podcast. Don't forget to leave a comment for the opportunity to win the Mythulu creation card deck that I can order and send directly to you. I hope you found some value and some interest. If you enjoy this podcast, please feel free to share it with someone that you think would get value from it too. That's a way of showing them some love. And you can also leave a review for it on the podcatcher of your choice. That's one way of showing me some love. Thank you for hanging out with me this week. Here's wishing you great writing and good Stark reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.